Okay, so last week, I mean, I didn't get through half of what I wanted to do, but it doesn't matter because I sent you all the PowerPoint and I'm hoping that you looked at it. So that's something that you can refer back to, because in the PowerPoint, I give you a kind of a, you know, some hints about how to unpack the new format of the new curriculum. So what I propose to do today is to spend, you know, half an hour or so doing an exercise. So, and that's the exercise that I sent around last week. So I might just share my screen. So, okay, can you see the ATESOL workshop thing? Yeah, you can see I've got a whole row of PDF files there. So now that's what I want you to do. So let's just discuss for a minute the best way to do this. You could break into groups and flummox around and have a go at it, which I don't mind if that's what you want to do. Or I could walk you through it with reference back to the PowerPoint. So which way would you prefer? Would you prefer that you have a go at it yourself and then we come back together and we discuss it? Or would you prefer that I sort of take you through it in a more scaffolded kind of way?
So we have a vote. Hands up those for Darren to take you through. Yes. Hands up those for do it yourselves.
I don't mind either way.
Okay, looks like take us through. Darren.
Take you through it. Okay, all right. So you've got that unit there. So the unit guide is there. I won't put that up just now. So let's just assume we're teaching a course. Okay, so here we are in XYZ organization, and we've got our cohort of students. So if you have the autonomy to be able to choose your own units, because within the courses there's the scope. If your organization hasn't chosen the units for you, there are pluses and minuses of that. But if within the courses, you've got the scope to actually choose the units, because the courses have different rules, and there's a suite of different units to cater for, I mean, it's not perfect by any stretch, as I said last week, as a compromise, but we took away the compulsory unit of learning. And then we just, we've given some different, choices according to how we ended up putting the units together and trying to get a spread of oracy and literacy. So assuming you've got a class, how are you going to choose your unit? So this is, and I'm pretty sure most of you have been teaching for a while. So, the sort of questions you're going to ask yourself, who are your learners? What is their level? What do they need in terms of their language? So do they need predominantly settlement needs? I mean, most of our AMEP clients are going to be in that category. And community and social needs, education needs, employment needs, they're all in there somewhere. So and then in terms of your actual language skills, so you're going to be thinking about what you want to teach them, what are they weak on, and etc. What's their backgrounds, what do they do, what can you sort of bring together as being a broad sort of swipe of needs. What sort of text and discourse skills are they going to need? So what sort of texts, if you've got a higher group who are oriented towards going into the workforce, they're going to be needing to be better at different types of texts than your beginners who just need their basic settlement stuff. So that type of consideration. And then integrating your content considerations. So what types of themes and stuff you're going to teach them, and in particular, and this because it's the VET format, what's your assessment burden and what evidence requirements? You've got to start thinking about assessment from the beginning. So that's just kind of a broad paintbrush about, the sort of things that you're going to think about when you're choosing units for your students, if you're able to actually do that, if your institution hasn't said you must do this and this and this unit. So, and then you're going to look to the course, you look at the course rules and you make sure that you follow the course rules, because then your students are going to be able to, graduate with a certificate. Okay, so they're just preliminary considerations. The hard bit is this one. It's unpacking a streamlined unit of competence. Okay, so, I've given you that unit. So read and write basic factual texts. The first thing that you probably, assuming you've gone through the process of knowing your learners' needs and selecting your units, how are you going to go about teaching and assessing this unit? Okay, so now this relates to some of the questions that people have asked. So I hope to sort of start to address some of those questions in what we do here. And the rest of it we'll just talk about once we've finished. But the first consideration, given that we are in a vet environment, given that it is compliance driven, it's evidence-based, it's evidence-driven, you've got to start thinking from the get-go, how are you going to assess that unit? Now you probably teach the units together, but in all likelihood, you'll assess the units one at a time. It's just too hard to assess more than one. There's too many bits that need to be thought of when you're conducting a compliant vet assessment, that it's too many bits to sort of consider to actually, be assessing them all at once. So we used to like integrated assessment, and practically it's good, but given that there's evidence-based needs for vet alone, let alone AMEP, you've got to start thinking about this. So why I mentioned AMEP separately is because AMEP and the contract requirements add a second layer of compliance over the top of your vet needs. So the first thing you're going to be doing, how would you assess the unit? What evidence needs to be collected and how will you collect it? So I'll just leave you to look at the unit guide and think about where you might find that information. I'm just going to give you 1 minute to do that. Okay, some hints on that. Okay, so I won't go to that one first, but let's have a look at some of those.
Darren, we're looking at your list of files, not. Yeah, we can't see.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah. But
oh, sorry, the list of files. Sorry. Okay, that's not very helpful. That's better. How's that?
Yeah.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry for that. I kept flicking back and forth between this. Sorry about that, because I changed screens with that. So, yeah. So how will you assess the unit and what evidence do you need to collect? Okay, so from the unit guide, where will you look? And I want to show you something from the PowerPoint. So my suggestions for doing this, once you've decided that you've got to assess particular units, start from your assessment. The unit guides are guidelines for creating assessments. So we've done all of that. Who are your learners? What units you're delivering? You won't be able to assess units together. If you're in the AMEP, you've also got to consider the fact that some of your students will be due for a progressive assessment in this particular term. Which indicators will you be thinking about? All of that is preliminary planning considerations. Now we're at the unit itself. Okay, so your text types and your themes, what type of assessment is required? Where do you look in the unit guide? The first place you should look is the performance evidence. Okay, so let's go there. So in a sense, you've got to start backwards with your planning. Once you've made your crucial decisions about learner needs and units to study, etc., and themes, what themes might work best, you've got to work backwards. And that might also feed into your consideration of themes to use. So what does this mean, performance evidence? Do we know what this means?
Yep.
Yeah, what does it mean? Someone tell me.
It means that your tasks have to use this text type, and you have to make sure that you've looked at that you've got the right number from the performance
Good
alternatives, and
yep.
you look at both elements and you've got the right numbers from each of those.
Excellent.
What we don't know is why an email would need to be 150 words long.
Okay, good question. Chris and I, when we were writing these things, and we were sort of thinking how long is, we looked at the ISLPR, we looked at the ACSF, and we were thinking at the level of the student, what they're going to come out with. It shouldn't be too long. One of the reasons why we limited it was to actually limit to give teachers some guidelines around keeping it all the same. So, you know, you couldn't have teachers some teachers may interpret the ISLPR, ACSF for this particular level as being, you know, something which another teacher would consider differently. So 150 to 250 was our kind of guesstimate at the sort of, you know, it was an estimate, you know, of the sort of length of an email that might allow them to have language at the right level to be able to, you know, do a realistic, real world sort of authentic type of task that wasn't going to be too hard, wasn't going to be too complex, wasn't going to be too dense, and also was going to present a enough challenge. So, you know, in a word, it was an estimate, and it was based on those considerations. You know, so yeah.
Now it's in black and white. How approximate can approximately 150 be? If I have something that does 130 words, is that approximate?
Sure, and you know, that's why the word approximately is there, because, you know, if you've got a good text which is 140 words long, but, you know, it's got the right level of complexity, it's demonstrating all of these types of things in it, you know, these sort of knowledge evidence type things, which really gives you your kind of grammatical sort of, you know, your grammar and your, you know, how hard the language actually would be, the sort of skills that you're going to expect from them, you know. So as long as that's covered, and you've got an email or an information text of 140 words or 145 words, it's fine. You know, so that's, you know, that's there for a reason. That you have to be careful using the words like approximately with ASQA. They don't always like it, but they allowed it to be here because, you know, you need that give and take. You know, so similarly, if you had a text of 270 words long, but if you've got a text of 350 or 400 words long, it's probably too long for a Cert 2, you know, so, and it's probably going to have too much information in it, and you're probably not going to be able to keep them to a reasonable time, and you're going to have to guide them a lot more in your assessment task. So yeah, I hope that answers that question. Yeah, but absolutely.
More questions?
Yeah,
yep.
Questions. So we have a look at the knowledge evidence. Are we there yet? Or can I ask a question about the knowledge evidence?
Yeah, so everything is accessible. Okay, so what this basically is, we had to think a lot and learn a lot to actually learn how to do this, and then what to put in here to make it acceptable. So as the answer was, you know, this is, you know, the sort of text that you can, these are texts that you can choose from. So here's your choices of the sort of text. This is basic factual text. Now, we had to find a way of bringing together families of similar texts, which are not necessarily exactly the same, but they're similar texts in a way that didn't duplicate the foundation skills training package. And basic is a term which gives you an idea of the level. So a Cert 1 and a Cert 2, the word basic is acceptable. So basic for us is going to be, you know, ISLPR, you know, 1 to 2, you know, or 2+ in this case, you know. So, and so that gives you basic gives you an idea of the level of complexity. Basic is also an ACSF term because ACSF is a bit more tied to the AQF than the ISLPR. So at a level 1 and a level 2, basic's acceptable. So yes, these are your text types that you would choose from. So you've got to make sure that they've read and comprehended 2 different ones from these, and that they've planned, drafted, and written 2 different ones from these. You know, we've decided we couldn't put all the same ones there because some of them may be a little bit hard for our learners. But these were reasonable sort of texts that you might expect your learners to encounter in their, you know, their further study journeys, for example, or their work journeys, you know, they would encounter, and their lives they're going to encounter, and maybe have to do things like an email providing information or a short information report, you know. So, and similarly here, the sort of things that they might encounter for those. So this is where you'd start for your assessment tasks. Okay, all right, you're going to give them, you've got this unit is, I think it's either 80 or 120 hours. I can't remember off the top of my head, but you're going to have 2 different reading assessments, and 2 different writing assessments. So this is just purely for the sake of the curriculum. I'm not talking about for AMEP. So if you had AMEP considerations to think about on top of that, there are basically 2 roads that you could go down, you know, or there's more than, but 2 roads which would be, you know, sort of good ways to do it from my point of view. The first way and the easiest way would be to see if you could integrate your curriculum assessment task with your AMEP PA task. So there are, on the AMEP assessment task bank that's administered by LWA, there are some tasks for different units from the CSWE, and which actually endeavour to do that. So they integrate both the curriculum requirements and the ACSF requirements for the AMEP PAs. So that's one way you can do it if your institution does not limit the types of assessment that you're allowed to do. Now, I work in TAFE New South Wales. So TAFE New South Wales, being a very large vocational education provider, has, you know, tries to standardize everything, you know, so, you know, we're just one section, English language teaching, we're just one area in a whole range of vocational areas, and we've still got to follow the rules of the organisation. So the organisation says that we're not allowed to use things from outside. So we're not allowed to use AMEP progressive assessment tasks off the ATB. We have to use tasks that have been developed by the organisation. So for the sake of curriculum, we have to use those tasks. For the sake of AMEP PAs, we use tasks off the ATB. Now that lends itself to a scenario of over-assessment. So how do you best cope for that? You know, unfortunately, we're tied by our organisation's rules, and you know, I understand the reasoning behind those rules, that it just makes your life even more difficult as a teacher and an assessor. So how do you best integrate that? My suggestion for that would be, and this is what we are training our teachers to do, is to use the AMEP ATB tasks as classroom practice tasks for your curriculum. Okay, so and in that way, you administer the AMEP progressive assessment as a formative task, for want of a better word, or it's just a classroom task, but you collect it for evidence for their AMEP PAs. You collect it for their, to give evidence towards their AMEP indicators that they've got to reach every 200 hours. Now, thinking about your AMEP classes as well, and I'm not trying not to get ahead of myself here, but if you've got AMEP, and it's on the task thing, you know, if you've got people in the AMEP, how many students do you need who need PAs? Which indicators will you assess for? So you've got to think about these things. And I suggest you think about these things in the very beginning, like the first week of your term, you know, so what PAs, what students need what, you know, who's going to reach 200 hours in their AMEP, so who's going to need a PA, and then you might have a range of students in the class, they don't all need PAs, but you might as well give them a PA because you can collect the evidence, you know, so you can collect your evidence in advance and then you just report on it when they reach their 200 hours. And this is the sort of thing that we're telling our teachers to do. You've got to try and make it easy on yourself. Okay, so sorry, that's not where I was. Okay, so yeah, so you've got to consider that, you know, so if you're considering that, you try and plan in a way that you do it in the most pragmatic way possible, and it's not always going to be easy, you know, and unfortunately that's what we're stuck with. Okay, so the first thing we're looking at is the performance evidence. The performance evidence are tasks that you need to see your students doing, you know, and you need to collect evidence of them doing successfully. And the task, we've written this curriculum in a way that the tasks, if they do these tasks successfully, they will demonstrate all of the skills that are described in this part of the unit. Okay, so all the skills that are described in the elements of competence and the performance criteria. Okay, now if they do it properly, you'll be able to mark everything back to that. You'll be able to cover all of those things. And if you design your task in such a way that you know that you're going to cover those things, you know, then you should be okay. Now, the next thing you have to consider, of course, is the knowledge evidence. Now, every assessment will not cover all of that. You know, so some of them are more appropriate for the reading assessments and some of them are more appropriate for the writing assessments. You know, so you will design your assessment tasks or select your assessment tasks according to what's going to be most expedient in that particular task. Now, over all 4 assessments, so 2 reading assessments, 2 writing assessments, you've just got to make sure that you've collected evidence that the student knows all of those things. Now, they have to know those things in order to be able to do those things. Okay, so that knowledge evidence is evidence of the knowledge that underlies the performance of all of these skills, you know, that you're outlining that they have to be able to do. So that's how these things work. So, and everything is auditable. Everything is, you know, and when auditable by an ASQA auditor and also auditable by our QA people, you know, so you've got to have evidence of it. You've got to have evidence that they know these things. So again, you design your assessment tasks such that they're going to be demonstrating. So these ones in the performance evidence are going to dictate what your assessment tasks will look like. And here in your knowledge evidence is the sort of knowledge that you're going to want to see your students demonstrate. So you design your tasks purposefully so that, or you select the task purposefully so that they can demonstrate that they know how to do those things. The next thing that you've got to consider.
Hold on.
Yep. Yep.
Does that answer your question?
Kind of, but I've got another question.
Yep.
Okay, so I've got a question about the performance criteria.
Yes.
So, like in element 1, interpret a limited range.
Hang on, sorry, could you just repeat that? Sorry.
So the performance criteria in elements 1, interpret a limited, that is the reading one, right?
That's right, that's correct.
So it is like, does the task, the assessment task, have to like tick all the boxes from 1.1 to 1.5? So for example, a test that consists of like 15 questions.
Yep.
Does that 10 questions is about detail, asking about the detail?
Yep.
Like 1 question asks about predicting vocabulary
Yep.
or identifying audience. So
Yep.
if the students can't answer the question, just 1 question,
Yep.
In identifying audience, purpose, and context, so does
Yep.
it consider a pass or fail?
Well, it would mean that they fail that assessment. And if you want the student to pass that's the rules of evidence, you know, and the rules of, you know, a vet, you know, they would fail. They have to demonstrate that they're competent in it. So the trick to doing that, you know, is to make sure that when you give them the assessment, you know who's going to pass and you've prepared them well. You know, so you've given them plenty of practice because they do have to get those things right. So yes, in short, and the answer to that is they need to do that. Yes, they need to pass those things.
Darren, what about if you give them 2 assessment tasks and they pass the first 2 in one assessment task and the last 3 really well in the other assessment task? So
you can do that. Good question. Yep. I was actually going to say that, you know, your assessment tasks, so say you've got, you know, given that this is your reading, so in all likelihood with this particular unit, on any one of these text types down here, they're probably going to do all of that. They're probably going to do 1 to 5, okay? So, you know, and you'll design your tasks so that they can do that, you know, and, you know, you're going to give them, you're going to have prepared them so that, you know, hopefully they're going to be able to actually do it and get all the questions right, for example. If they wouldn't, you might give them a second chance with another task to demonstrate it. And if they demonstrate it, that's tick the box and yes, they've passed. If they've demonstrated in one text and not the other, they would not be competent. But as I was just saying, you've got to give them, you've got to have reasonable adjustment and you've got to have some flexibility about how you give your assessment. So you're going to give them another chance, you know, so, but, you know, fair enough. There is a point past, it's not English forever. So there's a point past which you're going to say, well, you know, at this point, they haven't actually got the competence to pass this particular unit, you know, and they would have to repeat the unit. Those are the rules of vet, you know, so between your 2, say we're talking about a different unit, and say it's got more of these performance criteria within it. So it is definitely possible to have one particular assessment cover, you know, say these 3, and another particular assessment to cover the rest, you know. So just so long as you have collected evidence of all of that, you know, and it's sufficient evidence of all of that, you know. So why we've got two tasks down here is that we know that basically our learners are going to do all of that in each one of these tasks, you know. But so sufficiency of evidence is a rule of evidence. You know, you've got to have enough evidence. So by doing two of these things successfully, you've got sufficiency of evidence written into the way that the units are written, you know, and they would do all of that because you think about it, you know, they are going to predict, they are going to skim and scan, you know, they are going to know, they're going to have to know who it's written for and what it's about, you know, why is it written, you know, they're going to have to, you know, as I said, scan for content words and numerical information, scan for support. These are just a bare bones skeleton, you know. We actually, in the beginning, we had written a lot of this knowledge evidence back up in the top, and ASQA wouldn't let us keep it there. So after I left the project and Chris left the project, when the course got remediated, we took the people in our skills point that did it, just found a clever way around it of taking some of the information out of the performance criteria, out of this top part, and then just putting it down into the knowledge evidence to make sure it's still covered. So,
Darren?
yeah.
Jackie?
Regarding sufficiency of evidence, with the knowledge evidence,
Yeah.
do you need to make sure that across 4 tasks, each of these knowledge evidences are demonstrated at least twice? For example, a limited range of strategy, blah, blah, blah. No, what about the visuals and supporting meaning in a text? Do 2 of your tasks have to show that, or is 1 sufficient?
Look, probably 1 sufficient, you know, but you really, if you think about things like limited range of strategies to identify meanings of unknown words, you're probably going to cover that twice.
I know that one, the other one.
Which was the other one you pointed out?
Visuals, layout and visual supporting meaning in a text.
Yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, 1, you know, how layout and visual support meaning in a text, it might just be 1 question, you know, and that particular text might not lend itself to it, but if they've demonstrated it, I'd say try and collect them twice, you know, but the way you would do this is to map it out. So let me just see if I can bring that document up, because I've got a way of mapping these things. Let me just open.
That question's more general, so if
Yep.
you open the knowledge evidence, you see one particular element that you think they've done it once, but gee, to write another assessment task to put it in, I think that can.
Yeah, look, that's splitting hairs, because I'm not really an ASQA auditor. You know, I try and get it twice, but, you know, keep your tasks authentic, you know. So, you know, if you've got good evidence from 1 task, you know, say they've demonstrated it twice in the 1 task, I wouldn't bother about it in another task, you know. So if you've had a couple of questions, you know, which reflect the same things, you know, and they've been able to demonstrate it in that task there and then, you wouldn't need to do it again, you know. So, and some of these, for example, discourse markers, you know, so within the 1 task, you know, if we're talking about reading, you know, within the 1 task, there may be several different discourse markers, and there may be a couple of questions which deal with that in one way or another. So there's plenty of evidence, and you wouldn't need to ask it in the 2nd task. So, yeah. Does that answer that question?
Yep. Any more questions? Okay, we're on. Keep going.
Okay. All right. So, all right. So now the next thing we'd be thinking about is what assessment conditions are mandatory. You know, so now this is a tricky thing, because you know, if you think back to the old curriculum, assessment conditions are not the same as what these days in the new format, they're not the same as what they used to be. In the old format, they were a mixture of instructions to the assessor. They were a mixture of marking guide, you know, guidelines for making a judgment about whether a student passes or fails, you know. So they were a mixture of actually genuine assessment conditions, like what was required, you know, and so they're a mixture of a sort of a mishmash of different things. Now, that wasn't going to fly with the way that they do things now. So we took a lot of those old assessment conditions out and put them either up into the performance evidence or into the knowledge evidence, into the performance criteria. You know, so the only things you see here now are things that must be there. Like, so, and why you sometimes see nothing in the assessment conditions is that in this case you have something, that's there for the ACSF, you know, so some assistance from the teacher if requested, because that covers your ACSF level of assessment. You know, you're allowed to offer at ACSF 2, you're allowed to give the student assistance if they request it, you know, so that's the way that we get audited on that. Access to digital technology means that your student is allowed to, you know, they're allowed to use their phone or a computer to look up words or to look as needed, you know, so within reason. You don't want them cheating, you know, so, and you're not going to allow them to, I don't think it's reasonable to allow people to be using things like, you know, interpreters, you know, the sort of word for word interpreting, because they're going to make mistakes and they're going to get it wrong. You know, so you would monitor that, you know, within reason, but, you know, your students can have access to digital technology. And so the only things that appear here in the assessment conditions are things that absolutely must be there. They're must-be's, you know, so if you were to provide other means of support, you know, in a different context, you know, and you considered that to be reasonable, you know, by all means, you know, so, but these things absolutely have to be there. And if there was nothing there, well then, you know, you don't need to worry about it, essentially, you know, so that's why this is something that needs to be looked at. Now, when we're talking about the AMEP PAs, level of support is a particular consideration. Okay, so what I was alluding to before was, you know, what level of support's appropriate for quality teaching and learning. So we always provide modelling in our, you know, because that's in our methodology, in our cycle of teaching and learning. There's always modelling, but, you know, according to the ACSF, we're not allowed to do that at this level. It's dumb, you know, but we're not allowed to do it, you know, so, and they may even consider the amount of planning, drafting and support that the teacher gives in this particular unit. They may consider that to be inappropriate for ACSF too. So, you know, these are the sort of, you know, difficult questions that we've had to negotiate with the QA provider, and it's been a learning curve for them because they've had to learn to pull back a little bit on being so hardcore about the ACSF and actually give a little bit of grace to curriculum requirements, and they have done that. You know, so but you know, those are the considerations that you have to make here. So, you know, what support, if you're assessing for ACSF 2, the level of support's actually written into the unit, you know, so in this case, the level of support is here for ACSF 2. Some assistance from the teacher if requested, you know, so, but that's not necessarily written into every unit. So those are the things that you need to think about there, you know, so now, if you're moving on the journey of actually, you know, teaching and learning and planning, what skills and knowledge need to be taught to cover the curriculum? So in this case, you know, the curriculum, these bloody curriculum documents, okay, and I use that word intentionally, you know, so the format that they make us use is really just a statement of what the student will walk out the door with and what your assessment has to make sure that it covers. Now, how you get them there is up to you. So what you put in your cycles of teaching and learning to make sure that they walk out the door with knowing and being able to do this stuff really comes down to your experience and you know, your best foot forward as a teacher, you know, so you know, when you're planning these things, what skills and knowledge, you've got to make sure that you cover that. You've got to make sure that your assessment collects evidence of that, you know, of all of those things. And if you're doing the AMEP, so this is the extra layer of stuff that they've stuck over the top of it, you know, you've got to also make sure that the ACSF is covered. So that's a lot to be thinking about. It's a lot of burden on the teacher. Okay, so we could definitely do without the ACSF, you know, so we could do without that level of compliance, you know, just this level of compliance alone from the curriculum is really enough to demonstrate progress, you know, so I think that was, you know, in an attempt to harmonise the AMEP with the C, they put this stuff about the ACSF onto it, but really unnecessary because it's all covered by your ASQA requirements anyway. The students, if they're going to make progress against the curriculum, will make progress. But given that this is the nature of the contract, given that this is what the contract requires, we have to assess for that, and you've got to think about it, you know. So, and that means quite often, if you've, you know, and the way you design curriculum assessments, and, you know, this is I mean, we're doing a whole series of workshops on assessment design coming up for the AMEP, but the starting point really should be your curriculum. Have you covered the curriculum? And then what more do you need to do to make sure that the ACSF is covered, if there's any extra, or how can you integrate that into what you're doing with your curriculum? And then you've got to think about it in your cycles of teaching and learning, so the exercises you get the students to do. You know, and coming down here, suitable themes and topics. Okay, so this is where you come into your own as a teacher. What's our themes? What do they need to learn? You know, settlement. You know, so most of our stuff's around settlement in the AMEP. You know, so what are the usual topics that we cover? You know, so all the usual, you know, the usual tropes that you can pull lots of different things about. And then, you know, the text types are governed by the units, and then you start thinking about your cycles of teaching and learning to get them there. Okay, so what activities are you going to do? So the sort of things that we would do with, you know, basic factual text. I mean, you know what these things are going to be. So you're going to do some modeling. You're going to give them examples to read. You know, you'll pull your examples from different places. You've decided on your theme. So if you're doing a workplace theme, you might focus on these ones. If you're doing more community and settlement, you might do this one because that's the sort of letter that they might get from, you know, their insurance company or something like that. You know, this is probably quite a reasonable one, you know, your internet web page, if you decide on those things. So you're just going to give them models, you're going to take them through lots of exercises that will work through their language, you know, the language needs, the sort of grammatical things that they're going to be coming across. So all of these things down here, etc., you know, so, and you're going to take them from reading into writing, you know, the way that you do that as well, you know, so those are the considerations you start to make down there. And of course, then, you know, what resources are going to support you to do that, you know, so, you know, I mean, I was always looking over the shoulders of other people in terms of what resources they used. I was not one of those people who kept a bank of resources in my head or things on my computer. I just, oh, okay, right, that looks really good what they're doing there. I wouldn't have thought of that, and then just go and try it out, you know. So, but that's the way I used to do it. Some of you in the room, I'm sure, are very good at actually scoping out resources and thinking of the things that might be really good for your students to learn things from. You know, so, yep.
Darren, in terms of alignment, so
Yeah.
do you think CSWE 2 is equivalent to in terms of like beginner and then elementary to intermediate? So
Hang on. Just can you just say that again? Sorry, I'm having trouble with hearing that. Yeah.
In terms of alignment, so what
Yes.
do you think CSWE 2 is equivalent to? Is it equivalent to beginning level or like elementary, intermediate?
I'm going to throw that back to the whole class, all of you sitting there. What level, you know, what sort of words would you put on a CSWE 2? Give me some suggestions.
Post-beginner, pre-intermediate.
I would think that it is like somewhere between pre-intermediate to intermediate.
It's yeah. To me, it's an intermediate level. You know, so your entry and your exit levels of ISLPR are kind of, you know, so the entry is 1+, the exit is 2+. You know, so
2+ is what our Cert 3 is used to exit at, isn't it?
no, 2+. Yeah, well, that's a good question. In the way that the ISLPR used to be looked at, there was, and the way that the CSWE was written, there was no exit point. There was only an entry point, and the entry point was a 1+. But I think the way that it was done, and this is what I talked about last week, was that the entry examinations were done based upon the skills that were taught in the CSWE, and the ISLPR was assigned based on that. You know, so the skills in the CSWE came first. So the example I gave you last week was, you know, that writing a discussion essay. If you look at ISLPR 1+, even after 500 hours of learning, it will only be the most exceptional student that can write a discussion essay after 500 hours of learning, you know, coming in at a 1+. You know, so it is too low. So On paper, you're right. On paper, you're right. Your students would have exited probably there, even though there was no exit levels assigned to the old CSWE 3. They probably would have exited with a 2+, but that's a 2+ the way that it used to be interpreted. The way that we interpret it now is evidence-based. So what can they do? What can they do? What can they do? We moved all of those around.
Yes, Darren?
Yeah.
Jackie?
Well, we used to kick them out at 2. They were functional.
Can you hear that?
Yeah.
That's right, yeah. But what was considered 2, I think, back then, the way that we're looking at the ISLPR now is not really 2, you know. So I have a lot of issues with the way the ISLPR was used previously, because I'm coming from an evidence-based / vet sort of approach of give me the evidence for it. What can they do? Show me what they can do, you know. And whereas I think that that's not the way you did your ISLPR's assessments before, you know. So I think it was based more on your CSWE levels. So the ISLPR was known vicariously through the CSWE certificates, you know. So people didn't necessarily refer to the ISLPR documents unless you were the ISLPR people. You know, you actually.
I'm thinking that CSWE 2 is now at the level that our CSWE 3s used to
No, it's not. You know, it's not. It's probably somewhere below, but it's higher than what they used to come out at. So it's probably somewhere between where your CSWE 2s used to exit and where your CSWE 3s used to exit. Okay, so it's somewhere in between. It is higher, but it's not that high. So, you know, if you,
Hold on, Darren.
yeah.
This question, it's our CSWE 2s are more heading towards intermediate than they used to be.
I would agree with that, you know. So yeah, I'd agree with that. It's an intermediate level. It's sort of, yeah, it's pretty solid intermediate level, you know. And your CSWE 3 is upper intermediate, moving towards an advanced, you know. So
Does that in effect mean people have got further to go to get to so-called functional English?
yeah, they do, because remember, functional English now is defined in terms of the ACSF. So it's, you know, I mean, these things are kind of, you know, there's a lot of, you could debate this endlessly, I think, but ACSF 3 across those 4 different indicators is considerably higher than ISLPR 2, whether you look at it from
The thing is, I went to the recent LWA workshop.
Yeah.
And I believe that their exit level for level 1 and level 2 are lower than I had expected.
What do you mean lower in terms of, are you talking about level 1 as in CSWE 1, or are you talking about ACSF?
I'm talking about ACSF. So I just went to the LWA workshop, and the exit competence for level 1 and level 2 in ACSF actually are lower than I had expected.
Than you had expected. Did you used to teach on the C program?
Yes, I did.
Yes, and that's why. Okay, so I think the way that the auditors are now looking at the ACSF is different. So they are looking at it perhaps a little bit more like Chris and I were looking at the ISLPR. So they're looking at it more from an ESL perspective these days, I think, than what they ever used to look at it before. And firstly, and secondly, they're looking at it also more in terms of hard evidence. Okay, so what is evidence of this? And they're looking at it fairly literally. So they're looking at what that performance feature is, and then what that will mean in practice. So in effect, that has meant that you know, what were the old norms of ACSF assessment and the old norms of ACSF practice have changed. And it's changed based upon how the auditors are now interpreting the ACSF. You know, so this is something that I talked about with.
I just want to say something here. That is, I used to teach in the C program, but I taught the ESL learners. I didn't the native speakers.
Yeah.
And I'm using the criteria for an ESL or EFL learner.
Yeah. You didn't teach native speakers, is that what you were saying?
No, I didn't.
You didn't. It wouldn't matter, because you taught your class, okay, the way that you felt that you needed to teach them, but you would have assessed them for the C program based upon what the QA provider taught you to assess it to. So now that there were a lot of issues with the old C, the old C programs and the way that the QA used to do C. So who remembers they seem to be moving, different criteria from audit to audit. They always had certain themes that they used to like to teach to the assessors, and they used to like to get people to understand. Those things have changed. Okay, so the way that now, from my understanding of this, the way that the ACSF was implemented before, and the way that the ACSF, particularly the way that the ACSF was used as an audit reporting framework in the C program, was the culture of practice was to assess people, was to expect more of people than what you have to produce now. So the culture of practice was that they used to assess people higher than what they would be assessed now. And I'll tell you why I think that was, and that's because the ACSF itself is more of a lit num tool. The ACSF was a kind of, I suppose, a broad swipe. It was an attempt to try and catch ESL and literacy and numeracy, like people native speakers who struggled at school with literacy and numeracy. It was an attempt to try and put everybody onto the one scale. Now, Helen knows a bit more about the history of the ACSF than I know, and I've learned something from talking to her about it, but it was this big, broad attempt to actually try and do that. And, it's not necessarily successful, so, and I know the C program, the C program was the sort of, Centrelink kind of version of trying to get people into an activity and trying to do something, to be seen to do something to improve standards of literacy and numeracy and language, etc. around the country. And it was a convenient way of lumping ESL learners, and it still is, a convenient way of lumping ESL learners in with all of the people who need more support with literacy and numeracy. I think that that's a very defective approach, but that is the approach that the C program comes from. Now, because it's more oriented towards native speakers. Now, if you look hard into the ACSF, it's full of presupposed cultural knowledge. It's full of assumptions that our learners who are on the ACSF actually understand the cultural context of, for example, the domains, all of those different examples of what the learners will be doing with those indicators, the things that come after each indicator description. And even within the descriptions of the indicators themselves, many of them are not suitable for ESL learners because they're not things that our learners would do. The activities, the performance.
I all agreed.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now, why I'm talking about that is because I'm demonstrating why the ACSF used to be looked at the learners were assessed more harshly under the ACSF. So what used to be an ACSF 1 isn't anymore. What used to be an ACSF 2 isn't anymore. And it's changed because the QA auditor is now looking at it more from an ESL perspective, whereas in the past they were looking at it more from a lit num perspective.
Okay, so where are we going from here?
Okay, now my intention after going through all of this exercise with how I would unpack and pull apart, was that helpful about what I would do in terms of pulling apart a unit of competence? Has that helped you a bit? Yay or no?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So
yeah, we did a lot. We did a similar things like this at the workplace already. So
yes.
So the questions that I came here have already been answered. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. A lot of this stuff is actually. This is TAE related, what I would consider to be TAE related. So I've got all your questions on a document here. So I was hoping, and it's happened, you've started to ask questions in relation to this stuff. So I'm happy to go on and start answering questions now, so is it okay if I leave that stuff? And, and yep. Now let me see if I can, I'll share my question screen, and I've got sort of summary answers. So, can you see my questions now?
No.
Okay, hang on. Can you see them now?
But they're very small.
Can you make
Very
it
small. Okay, all right. Can I big that?
That's
Yay!
better. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, all right. So yeah, it's, all right, so AMEP related questions. So how many of the tasks out of one CSWE assessment can be used for progressive assessments of the students? Now that's a really hard question to answer because it's so broad, you know, so in each unit it's going to be different, you know, so you really need to go through that process that we just went through, which by the way, the PowerPoint that Helen sent around, the PowerPoint has sort of step-by-step what we just did then with that exercise. The PowerPoint has step-by-step suggestions for actually doing that. So I suggest you go back to the PowerPoint if you get stuck on things and for questions to consider. You know, if you've already done it in your workplace, great. You know, that's actually what you need to be doing all the time. You know, so this is for that. Now, drilling down into that, if we've got a unit of a CSWE unit, how many tasks can be used for progressive assessments? It really depends on the unit. So you've got to go through that process of thinking about what your curriculum task, what your curriculum unit requires, or your units require, because presumably you might be teaching, you'll be teaching more than one unit per term. So if you've got a term of, if you're in the AMEP and you've got a term of 10 weeks, you're not going to be just delivering one unit. You'll be delivering an integrated course, as we have always done, but you will assess your units, you know, say one at a time. So you might have 2 units, for example, to deliver in that particular time out of a certificate, or 3 units, you know, so you've got to plan out how you're going to cover that. So there's no one set answer for that one. You know, you'll be able to get some tasks for progressive assessments out of it, but you won't be able to get out of some units, and then you won't be able to get them necessarily out of others. You'll need help. Now, again, how to more effectively apply CSWE to cover ACSF touchdowns. So I'm assuming that's a similar kind of question. It comes down to your planning from the beginning, you know, so where are your students at in the class? Where are most of your students at in the class? Because your students in your class may be spread across ACSFs. You know, so you might have students, you say you're in a CSWE 2 class, you know, on average, most of them might have already ACSF 1s on many things, many of those indicators, but they might not have them across the board. You'll get your classic, you know, so-called spiky profiles, you know, so people who are good at one skill and not so good at other skills, you know, so you're going to have to think about that in terms of, you know, how can I catch most of my students? And if you've got students who need other indicators for their PAs, if they're meeting 200 hours, because you remember in the AMEP these days, every 200 hours you're supposed to demonstrate one indicator of progress against the ACSF. So say, for example, you're teaching that unit that we were just looking at on factual texts, so it's reading and writing unit, but you know, you've got some students who need reading and some students who need writing. You might as well assess them for both, you know, with reading, do a PA for reading, so you're going to catch all the students who need reading for that one, and do a writing as well, so you'll catch other students for that one. Remember too that even though your students may have a spiky profile, if they're in your class, because you are teaching, you're not just teaching reading, or you're not just teaching writing. You may just be assessing reading or just be assessing writing, but you're teaching everything, you know, in most classes all the time, you know. So your students who come into that CSWE 2 class and have have only a pre-B or something in their reading and writing, they're still going to make progress. So you may even be able to bump them up 2 indicators. So, you know, for your AMEP, you need to consider those things when you're doing it. The way, as I was talking about before, the way the ACSF is written into the AMEP is that if you look carefully at all of those things, so the performance criteria, the performance evidence, the knowledge evidence, and even in the assessment conditions, as I was demonstrating to you, there are little bits of the ACSF that have, you know, we've had to incorporate in some way, so that you can see there are chains of words or concepts which relate to ACSF performance features at that particular level. So usually, and this is where equivalencies are really difficult, you know, so you can't really, in my opinion, you can't really effectively say that ISLPR 1 plus is ACSF 1 is IELTS, you know, whatever, you know. So you can't really effectively say that because you're comparing apples with oranges. Yes, they're all fruit, but apples are apples, oranges are oranges. They taste different. They measure different things. ACSF measures different things to the ISLPR. Having said that, broadly speaking, a broad mapping is kind of possible. You know, so it's when you dig down in auditing, you know, that the differences become apparent. And when you try and design and validate assessment tasks to cater for curriculum requirements and ACSF requirements, then you really notice the difference. You know, and that's where equivalence tables just come unstuck. They're not very helpful. But broad level equivalences, I think you can draw, you know, so broadly speaking, you know, so broadly speaking, our students coming into a CSWE 2, they've achieved ACSF 1 in the current contract, in the current way that the current QA is looking at ACSF 1, they've achieved that. Not the old way, not the old C way that we were talking about before. Okay, so this is a problem that I see with people who come in with a strong background from literacy and numeracy, who have perhaps been used to teaching C classes or supporting C classes with lots of native speakers. They expect more cultural knowledge and more language from ESL students than what they have. So as a result, they won't put students, they expect a higher level of performance to attain an ACSF indicator. That was the regime, that was the culture of practice in the previous C program to which I was referring to before. Okay, it's changed now. So all of that's consideration about ACSF and CSWE, and it's not definitive. It's hard, you know. We're being asked to do difficult things. The department or the government, in wanting us to cover both curriculum and ACSF, has set us a very difficult task. Having said that, if you use the ATB, the LWA ATB, it is your best way of making sure that those things are covered. Those tasks attract less scrutiny from the auditors because they've been validated by the national working group that is convened by LWA. So they trust their own tasks. All of us as providers have representatives on the national working group. I'm on it, Simone Harris and myself are on it from our organisation, you know, and we participate, you know, in the validation sessions. You know, and you know, you reach a common sort of understanding. So, you know, if you use ATB tasks to meet your ACSF requirements, and if you are lucky enough to work for an organisation which allows you to assess the curriculum with those ATB tasks, then that's your best bet for compliance. Okay, so the ATB tasks themselves have mapping within them. So they have mapping to the curriculum, they have mapping to the ACSF. So the tasks that are up there have met the requirements for touching both sets of compliance. So use them. They're the safest and best way to do it. Okay, so that's kind of broadly. We might return to that as we kind of come through the questions. Okay, so a lot of the questions related to the VET format, and I think in the exercise we did today and the blurb and stuff that I was talking about last week and the questions from last week, we may have covered some of these already. So someone has written, I need more information about syllabus content related to CSWE requirements. Currently, my organisation only provides assessment tasks for CSWE. Teachers are creating CSWE content for the classroom in an ad hoc and inconsistent fashion. There is no syllabus design, no textbook or related content. I need guidance on selecting appropriate content beyond teaching directly to the assessment task. Fantastic question, fantastic critique of the current setup. Unfortunately, we're stuck, you know, so, you know, that's the answer to that. Let me just see if I've made notes on that.
The answer is a lemon.
Sorry?
The answer is a lemon.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I can't kind of, you know, address that really, you Yeah, what did I say about that? I said, yeah, it relates partly to provider and what they are providing, but also relates to the format. So the new format doesn't provide those details. So the old CSWE used to give you a lot more clues and a lot more idea about what to teach and how to go about it. And the new format just doesn't allow that level of detail. ASQA would have said, I'm sorry, you can't have that. That's an assessment task, or that sounds like a classroom task and it doesn't belong in the curriculum document. That's what they would have told us, you know. So by going through the process that we went through in that practical task, like looking at that exercise we did at the beginning, you have to draw on your own experience to be able to create your plan. So it comes back down to planning, and it comes down to your experience, and there's no funding to create those resources, which is a damn shame. You know, if there was funding to create resources which went along with these documents, it would be a lot better, you know. But unfortunately, I was having this conversation with one of our head teachers yesterday. Unfortunately, that's not there, you know. So you know, we're kind of stuck with that.
That's where people need to join their professional association so we can advocate for that.
Good idea. Yes, agree.
Just a minute, Darren.
Yep.
Just a comment on that, on having no.
Can you hear Darren?
Yes, I can hear. Yep.
On comment on having no sort of not enough guidance or textbooks or.
Yep.
And so on. Yeah, we're all using the older ones.
Yep.
But I mean, how much chance is there of things changing in the next foreseeable future? Because would it be worthwhile to create things for this when it might all be changed again?
Yeah, I for the foreseeable future, I don't see any chance of this changing. You know, if we can get it funded, that's terrific. If, you know, like, I mean, ACTA has a goal of actually getting, you know, creating a national curriculum, which I support, you know, and personally I support that, you know. I think it's a good idea. And, you know, if that can happen and then we can sort of, you know, somehow or other swing funding, then it might change. I can't see the format changing unless, you know, there's a broader discussion of the format of VET changing, you know. So I think there's quite a bit of critique around this format in the broader VET field, you know. So this format doesn't necessarily serve industry well, you know. So this format of VET compartmentalizes everything into individualized skills. So, you know, you get a builder who knows how to stand frames for a house, but they don't know how to, you know, build a roof. You know, so because in the old days that used to all be taught as part of learning to be a builder, but in this particular framework of VET, it's not, because it's all piecemeal and compartmentalized. So, and the same critique could be made of our curriculum, but we tend to teach it and deliver it much more holistically because that's how we've learned as ESL teachers. I don't think it's going to change, you know. So I don't think that in the near future that's going to change. That's a bigger debate. If VET changes and the format of VET courses changes, if we're still in the VET sector, we'll have to just basically conform, you know. So if we don't conform, we don't have courses.
So when's the next CSWE accreditation due? 5
years. So 2023. You know, so you want to get it, you want to have some movement in this before then. Accredited courses every 5 years. Training packages, you know, they have a much longer time frame. You know, so if we can get a very comprehensive training package created by putting together the best of, you know, CSWE and EAL and, you know, even, you know, whatever else is out there, you know. Queensland TAFE. I didn't mention that, but I mean, even whatever's from there that's usable, you know. So I mean, I think, you know, just a broad approach, you know. So but that's another debate. So the next question is, are the questions about audience and purpose compulsory to achieve a task? I think we talked about that. Yes, they are. Okay, so you know, now this comes back to your TAE ASS 502. That's perhaps one of the most important, most relevant units in the whole suite of TAE units, you know. So because, you know, we grumble and about having to do TAE upgrades, but actually that knowledge that, you know, what we did today is all kind of this unit, how to unpack the courses, how to design your assessments, etc. That's all the stuff comes out of this unit. And the rules for TAE, you know, because we live in the VET world and TAE is married to the VET world, that's where it comes from, you know. So by understanding those units of competence well, in an ESOL context, it enables you to understand the new format and what you actually have to do.
They were in the that was in the old one too, anyway.
Yeah, I think these rules have been gradually creeping in, so for quite a while, so it's not, they're not new, but it's a lot more in your face in the new format. It's, we must conform to the training package format. That's it, Now, this is a really good question. Why do students have to ask for clarification? Why did students have to ask for clarification in a speaking task to achieve it, even though they don't have a need to, as they have understood everything? Now, great question. Okay, so you need to ensure that to me would come back to designing your assessment task in such a way that you can pull that skill out of them, that you can get them to demonstrate that evidence. If you can, yes.
Students are married to native speakers.
What's that?
So they don't need to, because they speak to their spouse every day. They don't really need to understand. They don't really need to ask for clarification because they are married to a native speaker. They speak English.
Yeah. But for the
I tried to do that in a task where, I don't know, it was instructions or something. And I asked the student to explain why they had the gullamigudgy in the fridge.
I missed that, sorry.
to give them the opportunity to say, sorry, what were you talking about? And we practiced asking for clarification and all that, but she still let gullamigudgy in the fridge go totally by. I don't know if it was about saving face in the assessment task, but you can try in a speaking task, you can try and throw something in that you think that they won't understand, but you're the interlocutor, and you've got to think on your feet to try and have something that they understand.
I agree. That's basically the way around it, so they have to, you can't get away from them demonstrating this. Now, if you design an assessment tool, now you can do this, the course is set up for summative assessments, you see them doing that in class, so, you know that they know how to do it, but you've got to just capture the evidence, so now if you're exactly what the lady just said, if you're in your assessment task and you see that they understand that, think on your feet and ask them something that they're going to have to ask you for, so because you just need this is all about evidence capturing. This is.
She didn't ask.
Sorry?
She didn't ask me. I stood up and she just didn't respond.
Yeah.
So the only way I could think of doing it is to do this artificial thing where I say to the students, you must ask me about something I said. Exactly what you did. And it makes a total joke of the authenticity.
Oh, I know, and I know what you're saying, and I would just pass a student anyway, but you still need evidence of it, because that's we're bound by TAE rules, so we're bound to actually collect evidence of that. If you could write that into your tool somehow, that she did that, or you could collect evidence of her doing it in class, write it up. You've got to write it up in a way that's going to pass audit. It's still evidence, so you've got evidence of them doing that.
Darren, I actually want to defend that one.
Yeah.
Because in my experience, when students do exactly what Jackie said, precisely where you get terrible breakdowns in the workplace, where people nod their head and pretend they've understood something, but they haven't. So I think you have to teach it in a very inauthentic, explicit way. And you have to say to people, look, in your culture, and it's in our culture as well, you lose space. So Goffman's written about that. You lose space when you ask for clarification. So you have to be prepared to lose space. And you have to actually teach it explicitly. You've got to be willing to lose space in order when you don't understand something, because if you let it pass, you're in trouble. So I think that's a really good one myself.
100% agree with that. I mean, I actually agree with all of you. I know what the first people were talking about, and that's we're bound by vet rules to collect evidence of that. But I really agree with that, because this is a skill that people need, and it is more of a culturally based thing. And you are expected to ask for clarification if you don't understand, and therefore we also have to teach the cultural stuff that goes along with that, which is all the face stuff, you know. So, and actually you lose less face asking for clarification than you would to get something wrong further down the track and create an accident. Yeah. Exactly. So that, you know, you can frame it in that context. And I agree that, you know, if you teach it explicitly, and it might be kind of clunky and sort of inauthentic in teaching it explicitly, but they learn to make it explicit, and they learn to make it a natural thing, you know. So, and they learn, you know, as they learn the cultural competence, they learn how to use the language better to do that, you know. So, you know, strictly speaking, the example you were giving of the student not asking for clarification and then not understanding, you'd have to fail them for that. You know, strictly speaking, for evidence and evidence with rules of evidence and so on, they'd be failing for that. So you then have to, as I was saying, give them a chance to pass it and get them to do it. And then you give them the best chance to pass it if you have pre-taught it, if you've taught it explicitly and taught it in a clunky way and stuff like that. And it is a bit artificial. Unfortunately, we're stuck with vet rules, and we're stuck with rules of evidence, and we're stuck with getting them to actually demonstrate it, you know. So, you know, you got to think creatively a little bit for that one. But I do believe it's a good skill to have. You know, it's a good skill to have written into the curriculum for the reasons that we were just discussing. Can I move on?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so can you please outline where CSWE currently sits within the vet and higher ed sectors, as in qualification for progression to further study for ESL? What is its value? Now, I think I covered that last week, because it's tied to the AQF. So a Cert 1 is a Cert 1, a Cert 2 is a Cert 2, and a Cert 3 is a Cert 3. So in terms of levels of language, you know, you really want to see your students, you know, the people who go on to vet courses or other courses should really have passed at least a Cert 2 and preferably a Cert 3, because if they pass a Cert 3, they're not going to struggle, you know. So, but
Darren, can I just add something just for the people in Canberra? The Certificate 4 in Further Study, which is taught at CIT, not part of the AMEP, is accepted by University of Canberra for most of their courses.
That's good.
Things like nursing and stuff. So they will take that Certificate 4 for further study.
So, sorry, can I just ask about that? So if they've done a Certificate 3 course with the AMEP, and then they could go on to do Certificate 4 here at CIT.
Yeah, that would be their entry into the Certificate 4. But they could get in even if they hadn't finished the Certificate 3, if they passed the intake test, the entry test for that.
Okay, so that's
okay. That good example, and a good use of the Cert 4 as well. Yeah, we were kind of happy with the Cert 4. I mean, it had to, the Cert 4 and the old Cert 4 in employment, we had to do a little bit of surgery with. You know, so we looked at usage numbers, you know, and not many people there were not many people who actually used the whole Certificate 4 in employment, with the exception of Charles Darwin University and Bachelor College. I think they used it, but no one else.
Of course, all of the foundation skills units in it.
In the last iteration, yeah.
Right before that.
Yep. So we broke down the old Cert 4 and we took out the units that were most used, which were used, for example, in New South Wales in a program called SkillMax, you know, and they were funded, you know. So we took those units out and we created a course in. And then we took all the duplication out of the Cert 4 in further study and made it very much into a further study course, you know, and sort of aligned it to, you know, a little bit higher ISLPR. You know, so it would be a good kind of proxy EAP course or a pre-EAP course, you know, and a good course to pathway students into higher ed. And that's actually how it's being used there, so which is good. Okay, so how much flexibility is there in interpreting the CSWE? So press requirements to use a cursor or mouse when students are on an iPad, or approximately 80 to 120 words. I think we talked about that one, 80 to 120 words, 140. Yes, 140 would be fine. Okay, but 140 would be fine, but 250 probably wouldn't be in that context. you know, so thereabouts, you know. So now when it comes to using a cursor or a mouse with the students in the iPad, let me just see which one that was. You know, they actually, you have to see them doing it. Okay, so, yeah.
The question is about, there's two, it's pre-SWE, not.
Yes, I know, yeah.
Okay, and there's 3 requirements there for the pre-SWE students. One has that they can use a swipe device.
That's right.
That they can use a mouse.
Yeah.
Our students are working on Chromebooks which don't have mice. So how can they do?
Oh.
how can they do?
Yeah.
It's CSWE S001. It's elements.
I know it. Yeah, I know it.
We have touchpad Chromebooks.
You've got to see them use a mouse. Unfortunately, that's what they have to do.
Cannot do that whole unit because we don't have a mouse.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because those are really useful skills. You know, that unit was written for I mean, that's all performance evidence must be demonstrated as the tasks outlined in the evidence are designed to give opportunities to demonstrate the skills in the PCs. So you have to see them using the cursor and you have to see them using the mouse.
So if the word
yes.
wasn't mouse, if the word was a cursor/touchpad, we'd be fine. They're using a cursor. They're opening and closing, but they're using a touchpad or a roll.
Yeah. Look, that's probably a good suggestion. I'd suggest that you, at the end of the PowerPoint, you see there's there's a contact Debbie Richardson. I'd suggest you write that one up and send it to Debbie as a you know, when they go, or if they have you know, an opportunity to review and sort of change things around, you know, so that might be a good one to put in there. You know, so you know why that unit was written is because you get people with no exposure to technology and no or very little formal education, so you're teaching them from scratch. So that's your classic example of a Sudanese refugee who hasn't been to school, you know. So and had
classic example of words being written in black and white and technology's moving on.
Yeah, it's right, and it's and things, when things move on, unfortunately, things such as this get outdated quite quickly. You know, it's not the first example that I've seen of this, you know. So I mean, there's another example that was pointed out to me yesterday where, you know, we sort of tried to write SMS language into some of the higher units, and then now you've got, you know, many of the phones, most phones that people use have autocorrect, so those whole abbreviations conventions are falling out of favor because autocorrect automatically corrects what and picks up what you're trying to write and just puts it in there anyway. You know, so it's sort of, you know, it's a bit hard. We're always kind of playing catch up with these things. I think that's a good suggestion, and I'd like you to write that to Debbie, you know, to write what you just said to me about cursor. You can't write and or in a PC, so, and they don't like or either, you know, so you know, so we have to find a way around that, but by all means make that suggestion. Now, with regard to, I'll move on to the next one. With regard to factual text, no time limits given for all the writing tasks. Does this mean it is that the teacher's discretion or not allowed? So no time limits given. So, you know, that means it's not mandated. So basically, you know, no time limit is, you know, it's a reasonable amount of time according to you, you know, as the teacher. So, you know, now what is a reasonable amount of time? Think about it, you know. So if a person's taking 3 hours and they still haven't finished, they're not at the level, you know. But if they've taken, you know, 45 minutes to go through the whole process of, or an hour to go through the whole process of drafting and, you know, then you give feedback and then they make their corrections and present a final copy, that's probably reasonable. So, you know, I think you've got to just use the discretion with that one, you know. So, now, questions will relate to the grammar skills for further study writing. I can't remember this now. Okay, so what I've said here is, yes, it's deliberate. Does it need a time limit? That's a question you need to ask yourself. Does the whole process need a time limit for that particular activity? Look to the ISLPR. There's no time limits. It's at the teacher's discretion. Okay, so look at the evidence required, and if there isn't one, then, you know, basically you decide what's reasonable. completion of each level does not adequately prepare students for the next level. What suggestions do you have to overcome this, especially for Cert 2? There are not enough speaking options to choose from to prepare students for the demands of level 3. Now, I dispute this. I don't agree with this. Now, if you look at the course rules and the size of the units, and as well as the choice within the units, you'll see that there's actually plenty of speaking. There are less oracy units in Cert 2 than literacy units. However, there is no reason why you would not choose the 2 oracy units that are there in the compulsory section of the course rules. So the compulsory section of the course rules for Cert 2 gives you a choice of you only have to do 1 oracy, I think, you know, because we knew it was light on oracy units. And that was because we based the course upon the previous course and the skills that were taught. And then we mashed the old modules together, you know, so, and I think we might have had to move some things up or down according to ISLPR and ACSF. So if you were to do both of the units from Group A, both of the oracy units from Group A, that gives you half of your course in terms of nominal hours in oracy. So I think it's spoken procedural texts, and it's also the I think it's the social texts, you know, so you've got 2 different contexts to cover quite a range of oracy. So I dispute that there's not enough oracy in Cert 2. And in terms of adequately preparing students for the next level, I also don't agree with that. I think that, you know, by looking at, you know, the exit levels of the units, definitely give the students a starting point for the next certificate. You know, and there is enough breadth within the skills that you can choose if you choose your units according to your cohort, where you can actually bring them up. What is problematic is the fact that we had to write the course for the AQF. So writing it for the AQF, and then, I mean, that's not problematic in terms of the rules, but it's problematic in terms of the way that the courses are traditionally delivered. Okay, so now the delivery is up to the institution, up to the RTO. So the courses have to be written for the AQF. So we've got to allow for 600 hours, for example, in a Cert 2, 600 hours in a Cert 1. Those are AQF requirements. So, and the nominal hours give a range of hours which allow for those requirements to be met. However, when you're in a teaching institution, quite frequently you don't teach the course over 600 hours. You may deliver the course, if it's full-time, over 300 hours. So you've got to concertina all of that into your delivery time frame. And that's where it gets a bit more tricky. So you're demanding and expecting of your students to be using their language outside of class, you know, and they have to be. Now, if they're in the workplace and they're teaching, they're you know, an English-speaking workplace, they will be. If they're married to an English-speaking spouse, they will be. But if they're not, you know, it's you know, you've got to actually push them to do it. And of course, that's a perennial problem with our particular cohort of students. You know, so that's what creates problems there in terms of students, you know, us giving them the benefit of the doubt if we pass them, when, you know, they might struggle in the next course. You know, so it's a consideration. It really comes down to rules of VET, but also it's then the provider's choice. And this is, unfortunately, the VET system is set up like this. It's up to the provider, the way that how long they choose to schedule the course for. So, you know, this is, and to sort of quote ACTA and Helen's papers to the department, it's a way of cost shifting. So instead of funding the number of hours a student actually really needs to learn a language, because if we were able to teach a course for 600 hours, excellent. You know you're going to actually give students a much better foundation for their language skills. You know, but there's pressure from all sides, and including pressure from the students themselves. They want to move quickly. You know, so they want to get ahead. They want to do another course, get a skill, and go and get a job. You know, so they don't want to spend 2 courses, a year's worth of study in English. Some of them are happy to do so, and other ones are not, you know, so that's another pressure. But, you know, funding pressures are also there. So courses are only funded to be delivered in 300 hours. If I think about Smart and Skill, for example, in New South Wales, or, you know, and the various other similar, you know, VET funding regimes that you've got in other states, you know, so there's limitations on funding. It's not fair. You know, so, and it's not fair on the provider, because they have to deliver a 600-hour course in 300 hours because they're not paid to do it otherwise, you know. So, and the only way that they can scrimp on that is to pay their teachers less. So, you know, and that's, you know, cut costs and deliver X amount of content in a ridiculously short time frame. And this is, in short, the problem with the vet sector, you know. So we suffer from that.
Darren, have you been reading our EBA, Darren?
Sorry?
Have you been reading our EBA?
No, you just have to know about that stuff. But
Darren,
yeah.
I'm noticing the clock.
Time, yeah.
And so I don't know how many more questions you've got.
I got stacks more questions, so there's a big list of it, yeah.
So maybe we should ask people to, if they've got one that's really burning, to put you, and if you could answer as short as possible without.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's good to tell me that because I can waffle on a bit.
And also your the answers that you put on the side there, maybe we could get that from you sometime.
Yeah, okay, yeah. They're sort of just brief notes to myself, really. They're not like I'm giving comprehensive answers and more, because I realise probably what I'm telling you is touching on many of the other questions and difficulties.
So let's use the last 3 or 4 minutes for very urgent questions or comments or whatever.
Quick question. This is from my friend Leanne. For a part-time class, how long will an assessment task last for CSWE? Her part-time class studies 5 hours a week.
Yeah.
Is it reasonable for her students to do an assessment task in January and it still be recent enough the following January, February?
Oh no, probably not that long. Well, that's tricky because, you know, this is for AMEP.
Yeah, AMEP.
Okay, so is it the current? If it's the current block of 200 hours, it's totally acceptable. So if they're doing 5 hours a week, how long is it going to take them to do 200 hours? So
200 hours affected in CSWE.
No,
it's not in CSWE. That's for the AMEP. In CSWE, if you assess them and they're competent and they're still in the course, no problem.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else? Okay. Do you want to pick any question there, Darren, that you thought was clear?
Okay. Let me roll it down. Okay. So there are lots of really good questions here. I think we covered fitting curriculum and assessment into an 18-week course. I was just talking about that, and I was talking about planning before. We talked about this does not produce a subordinate clause. I mean, I think that was in the answer we talked when we were talking about clarification strategies. I think that's kind of similar to that, you know, so that the same strategies would apply. You try and give the student a chance to actually do it if you can. We talked about time limits. Inconsistency between opinion and writing and factual writing, where opinion can have models but no model with the factual writing. Is it possible to use a model? Yes, of course it's possible. Be wary with your ACSF assessment. If you're looking for an ACSF Cert 2, modelling, you can have it in your pre-teaching, but you can't have it in the assessment because, you know, they will consider that to be too much scaffolding. Now, do the tasks need to be different? No, yes, they do. 2 reports I don't think would be acceptable. You've got to do 2 different ones. You know, now we talked about time consuming as per assessments. I mean, I think that's a tricky one. You've got to just be practical with that.
I've got another quick question.
Yes, please, yeah.
Instructions, directions, basic procedure. What's the difference?
What's giving directions and a basic procedure? A procedure might be broader. Yeah.
Instructions. Yeah.
Sorry? Yeah.
Instructions.
Yeah, instructions. A procedure can actually contain. Chris and I researched this and thought long and hard about it. You know,
I
so.
researched it too because I was confused about a recipe, giving instructions, and following directions. And 7 million places I could go to say they're all the bloody same.
Yeah, well, they're similar text types, you know, and it's a similar format, you know, and a recipe, what is that? Just a set of instructions, you know, so, and giving directions is also a set of instructions, but it's directions. It's how to go from A to B. Giving instructions might be a workplace thing about how to use a particular piece of machinery. A procedural text is a bit broader than just instructions. It may contain instructions within it, you know. I mean, actually, instructions are procedural text, but procedures, if you look at written workplace procedures, they often include explanations as well. So as we kind of got more complex and we're looking at ways to get around the foundation skills training package, that was one of the creative ways we got around that. So a whole procedure may include some explanation and may include some instructions. Yes, you're right, of course. Procedural text, basically, it's just imperatives and a set of instructions, you know, one way or another, yeah.
But can I get them to do a recipe and how to shut the office and how to follow bushfire escape plans, and that they're all different? Or
are they separate? Are they? I can't remember just off the top of my head. I can't remember in the unit guide, but if they're listed separately in the performance evidence, yes, you can.
Depends how you interpret them.
Interpret them fairly literally, okay? So don't just take it as black and white. And from that perspective, think of it like an auditor. So you get an ASQA auditor who knows diddly squat about ESL, doesn't know anything about text types. They're just going to go off the words off the page. So if you've given them a recipe, if the list in the performance evidence says a recipe, says a set of written instructions, I can't remember what it says, just go off what it says in the performance evidence and take it at face value. You'll be safe if you do that.
Label my recipe as directions, it'll be fine.
I think you're stretching it, but, you know, I think you're stretching it, but, you know, if you get an auditor and you say it's directions, I wouldn't say that. I would say directions are how to go from A to B. I would include the recipe more with the instructions, you know, so, yeah, I think that one's probably twisting it a bit too far. Can I answer this question? Why is there no general English option for the Cert 4? Okay, so there's no demand and there's no funding for that. Okay, so by the time you get up to a Cert 4 level, you have to have a specific purpose. There's just, by the time people get to that level, there's not that many people who want to learn general English at a Cert 4 level. They're either going to want to do it to get into higher education, or they you know, want to do it for a job. So mostly a Cert 4 is about higher ed.
It wasn't my question, Darren, but I'm guessing it might be because the employment one used to be, I haven't taught on, from a while ago, it was so specifically focused on specific small things that it was hard to do general stuff with it, like, you know, to satisfy everyone looking for
it is, and when you're writing these courses, it's also that we've got those same limitations. So, you know, you can't kind of, it'd be lovely to write a general course like that for, you know, your people who come in and just want to improve their English, you know, but we can't in this environment. You need to have a purpose for it. And, you know, I mean, it's good that we did this too, because, you know, the minister's talking about outcomes. The immigration minister is talking about outcomes. So we've got to demonstrate outcomes for, you know, our courses and for our program.
But
Cert
4 isn't in AMEP, so it's kind of, we used to have a general English option in our own accredited course, and we used to always fill that class.
Okay, yeah.
So, as I said, it's not my question, but I kind of know where it's coming from.
Yeah, I think I do. You know, if you used to fill that class, that's great. You know, but you know, these days we looked at, as I said, we looked at enrollment figures and stuff, and, you know, we just had to take the outcomes focused option, which is, you know, it's an outcome. If you get people into a job or into a higher ed course or into a vocational course, that's an outcome, you know, and we've got it increasingly being asked to demonstrate outcomes, you know, so, and I would suggest this to all of you who are working on the AMEP, you know, that your institution really should be tracking outcomes so that you can demonstrate the success of the program, because the program itself, you know, it's often nebulous to demonstrate the success of the program. We know it's successful. We know students actually get a lot out of it. Whether they immediately go into other courses or not is another thing, but they'll often come back at some point later when their lives allow it. You know, so tracking outcomes is going to be crucial in terms of the long-term success and the long-term funding for the program.
Okay, well, it's 7 minutes past. Is there anything anybody wants to ask that can't do? All right, they're all shaking their heads. So,
it's information overload, yeah.
So I don't know if you think it's worth sending us those little notes that you made on the side, Darren. What do you think? Now,
I'll have a look at them, and yeah, and yeah, I'll have a look at them.
All right. Well, please don't do any more work on it though, because you've gone to a huge amount of trouble here, which we really appreciate.
Well, thank you. I know a lot. I've been living in this world for the last couple of years. So, you know, when you do work at this, it's kind of a meta level. It's kind of a level beyond teaching. And so you have to consider all of these things, you know, and when you're just working as a teacher and teaching and assessing in a college, you often don't realize the restrictions and limitations that these things get placed upon these sorts of things. So, you know, I know a lot, and that's why I tend to kind of talk on and probably need a bit of direction sometimes, but I hope it's been helpful, you know, so, yeah.
Well, I don't know about the rest of everybody. I'll actually do an evaluation sheet for you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. It may not happen for a few days, but I will definitely do that. For me personally, it's been valuable. So thank you. And how you can stay in that world and how the rest of the people in this room can stay in that world and stay even marginally sane, I do not know.
Yeah. Look, I'm in my current job in order to stay sane. You know, I got sick of being a teacher and a head teacher, being bullied around by all these requirements and not having any power over it. So, you know, that's what got me into course writing, to try and fix up things that were problematic and at least do something that could push back a little bit against it, you know. And then in my current role, I'm in a role where I'm actually educating teachers and creating, you know, sort of policies and procedures to try and mitigate the damage, you know. So and I have a lot more control on my life, you know, so that's why I'm doing this.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for the interest and good questions, and yep, well, I try and help you as much as I can.
Hey.
Thanks. Signing off now.
Okay, all right.
Thanks.
All right, guys.